So this is actually a project that I'm working on under the support of the British Academy Visiting Fellowship, hosted by CREAM, University of Westminster. And I'm looking at the relationship or the role of salon photography or pictorialism in making the nations during the 1950s and 1960s in Singapore, Malaya, and Burma. So primarily, I'm doing archival research in the UK, working with the materials, of course, from the Royal Photographic Society, at the British Library, at the National Archives, also at the Durham University, and I think some other collections. I think obviously the three places shared a kind of similar colonial history, and actually that's also one of the reasons why I made a proposal to include these three countries when I applied for the British Academy Fellowship, and thinking that I think some of the materials will be in the collections here in the UK. I think the tradition, the education tradition in terms of maybe the educated class in the colonial period all speaking English, I think that kind of create a framework of maybe approaching the three places. And that I think shows up quite well when we look at, for instance, the connection with the Royal Photographic Society, especially when we compare, for instance, places like Vietnam, which has a slightly different colonial history. I think salon photography, I think we have to look at salon photography as, I would like to imagine it still has a strong presence in Southeast Asia. And I think one of the reasons why it has such a strong presence was because it has always been implicated within the political processes of colonization, later on decolonization and nation building. And so when we approach the topic or the praxis of salon photography, we can actually think through some of these political processes and how popular photography was involved in many of these, the process of decolonization and nation building. I would say that in terms of state building projects by the state, starting from the colonial period all the way until the nation building period, popular photography, particularly salon photography, was involved. The photographers were involved either in organizing competitions, exhibitions. So they were very intimately involved in all these projects. And I think part of it has to do with the connections between the people that were working or involved in the state machinery and also the photographers. And this linkage came via patronage. I think as all art practices, right, we all require, art practices requires patronage to some extent. And there were quite a few key figures, both from actually the national period and also the colonial period, that were involved in terms of supporting the practices of salon photography. I think one very obvious example would be Malcolm McDonald, who was the Commissioner General for Southeast Asia until 1955, when he was then posted to India. And I'm in the process of looking at some of the letters and correspondence that Malcolm McDonald has left behind, and it's now actually under the collection at Durham University. And you can see a very close connection between him and many of the artists and also photographers. He was invited to open exhibitions. His photographs were actually exhibited in some of the exhibitions in Malaya. So there's quite a strong connection. The challenge now is actually to see what's the legacy of his involvement in the nation building period. Royal Photographic Society is one of the oldest photo societies in the world. It's a major reference point for many of the photo clubs in Southeast Asia. So it has obviously a big collection that is very well kept. I think now most of it rather is in the V&A. As you know, I'm working at Bristol. I'm working with some of the membership cards because the processes of like decolonisation, nation building, and also Cold War, there was quite a bit of displacement. Archives have been scattered in Southeast Asia. The membership cards which is now in Bristol, which remains in the hands of the RPS, are very valuable information because they have addresses. Sometimes they tell you, somebody that was involved in photography in Cambodia, where of course many things had happened, quite tragic stuff has happened, and you see membership cards from practitioners in Cambodia, and sometimes it gives you information about, what kind of, like, they might be working with, some of them were obviously involved in studio photography, some of them were, in Malaya you see like photographers working for, let's say, railways and other state infrastructures. So that's one. And then with the correspondence, which is now archival materials and correspondence, which is now at the V&A, I'm trying to get a sense, especially through the council minutes, of the kind of like interface between, let's say, practitioners from Southeast Asia and, let's say, the executive committee at RPS. Yes, particularly at the British Library, we are, thankfully in Singapore and Malaya, the situation is a little bit better because quite a few of, particularly in Singapore and also Malaysia, we still have quite a good collection of the old papers. So at the British Library, I'm focusing mainly on the Burmese collection. We have a very good research assistant, Shun Lei, who is helping me look at a very important Burmese journal, which is called Myawaddy. And Myawaddy is actually published, still continues to be published by the military. And since its inception in the 1950s, it has always run a photo contest. And then one of the first critics of Burmese photography, Kin Lei Mao, who was a member of the Myanmar Photographic Society. And also we have his membership cards at Bristol, so RPS member, and he was one of the main judges, and he was writing about the submissions. So we are trying to do a close reading of that magazine. The most interesting material at the National Archives actually has been the records of the British Council. The British Council was an important space for salon photography and pictorialism, particularly in Burma and Malaya, and of course also Singapore. Many of the early exhibitions were hosted there. So I think the British Council records give us a very strong sense of the close relationship between the salon photographers and the British Council. And the interesting thing, at least the question to me right now, is as we know, after 1948, Burma was already independent, but virtually all the exhibitions that the Myanmar Photographic Society mounted were all in the British Council. So that's actually quite an interesting phenomenon, and I'm trying to also understand why did they choose to continue this working relationship with the British Council. I think I'm very mindful of trying to suggest that there's a kind of Asian form of pictorialism, because I think that has been it has been a preoccupation by many salon photographers in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong, where there has been, since the 1950s, a strong interest of trying to say that there's a kind of Chinese salon photography. I'm a bit mindful of that because I understand that in some ways, this kind of manufacturing of a certain Chineseness of salon photography is really a kind of reaction towards, what would be European or British pictorialism. So I'm a bit mindful of that. And we have to be kind of like conscious of the fact that one of the major growth periods for salon photography in Southeast Asia was the 1950s. And if we know the European history, that's already kind of like several decades removed from the peak period of Western European pictorialism. So I'm a bit mindful of that. But in short, by the 1950s, the photo clubs in Southeast Asia were really a kind of catch-all for people who were trying to test their skills, to learn photography, because there were no schools. So you have quite a lot of them that were interested in pictorialism. They were submitting to competitions, particularly to the RPS and also to their own clubs. But at the same time, you have a small group of people who were there because there were no other organizations around. I think before I came, I have been already working on this topic for quite a long while, and as you know, I worked quite a bit in Hong Kong because Hong Kong was widely seen as the kingdom of salon. So, in fact, Heritage Museum in Hong Kong inherits quite a substantial collection of materials related to salon photography in Southeast Asia. But I think coming to UK is really important because now you can see it, by changing my position, now you can see what, let's say, the Far East looks like from the perspective of, let's say, RPS in the UK. And because of the colonial relationship, particularly the materials from Burma, some of them are much easier to access here. So I think it's a great opportunity. The British Council materials are definitely excellent and very useful in terms of thinking about what was the kind of like relationship between the late colonial period towards the nation building period and how salon photography played a role in it. I've been slow. I mean, this is, as you know, this is actually towards the end of my stay. So I'm now slowly transiting to looking at actual prints. And of course, RPS has such a wonderful collection, which is now under the care of V&A. So I'm starting to look at the materials that they have, and I mean it's a big collection, and I'm slowly trying to pick out materials. I suspect there will be a lot more, and I think V&A is now also in the process of digitizing and also making sense of the massive archive that RPS has bestowed to them. So I think it will take a while. Yeah, but I'm starting to take a look. Wanted to learn a little bit more about Derek Knight, who eventually became the president of RPS. In the 1950s and 1950s, he started out as a shell photographer, and the Singapore Camera Club, I think, hosted his exhibitions in the early 50s. So one of the first, I would think that was one of the first solo exhibitions that the Singapore Camera Club hosted. So I'm quite interested, and Derek Knight was presenting a view of Southeast Asia to the viewers in Singapore and Malaya. So I'm a bit interested in terms of what was the kind of Southeast Asia that he saw. And so there were a few big boxes that Derek Knight has kind of like left behind with RPS now in V&A. So I'm on my last visit to the print room, I was looking at those prints. I think originally for the British Academy Fellowship, I promised that I'll do a few public talks in the UK before I go home. And of course, I'll publish a journal article. But I'm quite confident that the materials that I've collected from the UK will probably fit into future work, and it might be a few articles or maybe a future book. Of course, I'm quite involved in the communities in Southeast Asia, so the materials that I collected here definitely will be shared quite publicly in Southeast Asia. So that's, I think the materials will have a long afterlife actually, I think. I'd like to thank RPS and also Michael for spending so much time and hand-holding me for the research. There's a lot of things that we obviously don't know in terms of the details, so it's really useful to have you around and to hear your experience, and to ask you about details about the membership cards, and some of the details of how the day-to-day running, decision making of RPS, in terms of the executive council and stuff like that. So it's really helpful. Clears up a lot of the questions that I have, and I think it points me to a kind of realization that I must be a bit more careful in terms of thinking about what really happened between the late colonial period, and particularly the expat photographers that were, let's say, in Singapore and Malaya, and what kind of legacy that did they really kind of like leave behind in Singapore and Malaysia.
So when I was Chief Executive of the RPS between 2011 and 2018, and even after that until more recently, the RPS has always engaged with those Southeast Asian photographic societies and its membership in that part of Asia. So it has chapters in Asia where those members sort of meet and undertake activities together. So there's chapters in Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, which are particularly strong. And they've engaged with London. I think the members there value their membership of the Royal Photographic Society. It's still seen as prestigious, and they are still keen to try and secure their fellowship or associate of the RPS. And that's really got a long historical background. When the fellowship was introduced in 1895 and the associate in 1924, they really became the high points for a lot of amateur photographers to try and achieve, particularly the fellowship. And post Second World War, again, those distinctions maintained that value, and fellowship was particularly valued, particularly in Asia. I think the royal connection's important. I think the RPS as an organisation had a particular value, and partly I think because of that colonial history and that link between the UK and those particularly Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, and the particularly close ties between those countries, and then more widely with India and perhaps one or two other places as well. But those were really valuable, and those historic links and ties have, from the particularly sort of the post Second World War, have continued to inform the membership out there, and those links are still maintained today. So in some ways that relationship between the RPS chapter and the local photographic societies, whether it's Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong even, is really around the membership, because obviously there's, a bit like the UK and camera clubs here and the RPS, there's often a shared membership, so they're members of both the RPS and the local society. I think there's also probably a little bit of a healthy competition between them as well, and clearly there's a group of people that may just belong to the RPS or particularly just belong to their local society because it offers something that maybe the RPS can't deliver, because we're obviously thousands of miles away and we rely on volunteers in those countries to organise events and activities to make that membership of value beyond the distinctions. So the RPS, particularly after the Second World War, I think realised it needed to modernise, and it was always trying to secure more members. So I think it set up what they called corresponding members in particular countries, and tried to establish links between the Society's headquarters in London and some of those countries, Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, and Malaysia, Singapore, all of those countries, particularly where there'd been close links, perhaps from a colonial perspective. So those corresponding members acted as the focus for that, and then that sort of evolved when the RPS again realised it needed to, I think, reinforce and strengthen those links. That sort of became what were termed chapters, basically, which had a much stronger remit to organise events and workshops or activities and photo shoots and all of those activities that the photographers on the ground wanted to partake in, but under the auspices of the RPS. I think the affiliation scheme that the RPS, which was actually first set up in 1890, particularly for British camera clubs, and then accepted overseas societies and clubs, that affiliation scheme, I think after the Second World War, was gradually being wound down, but I think it still had value for those societies, particularly overseas, because it gave them a link back to the RPS. And I think the RPS was still seen as the premier society. So I think it was as much about prestige as anything else. And as photography evolved and as salon photography evolved, then the Photographic Society of America, which is the PSA, that offered particular benefits that I think the RPS wasn't able to offer or decided it didn't want to offer during the 50s and the 60s, particularly around recognising salons and competitions. The RPS wanted to stay a bit more aloof to that. But the PSA was able to offer something, particularly of value to those societies, but the RPS still had a certain cachet and relevance and importance for those organisations locally overseas. I think there were one or two presidents that did travel to and actually some of the council members also had their own trips. So some of the editors of some of the photographic press, for example, were also council members, and they would undertake trips to Asia, Australia, and actually talk about the RPS as part of their trip. Likewise, there were photographers who again undertook tours to show their own work and literally went to several countries on these big overseas trips and spoke about the RPS and membership and the value of the distinctions, and were able to act as an ambassador for the RPS on what were essentially private or even sort of commercial trips. I think by the time you get to the 1980s, the RPS realises it needs to sort of reinforce and further enhance those links overseas. So Lady Doreen Pollock, who was the wife of Sir George Pollock, who had been president in the late 70s, early 1980s, she takes up the mantle of being the overseas coordinator. And she's really into the overseas chapters. She's pushing them to do things. She's acting as a information point as much as anything else, and a point of contact for those overseas societies to have someone that they can talk to about the RPS. So she, I think, is a really important figure because she was, really involved and interested in them, and was able to act as that point of contact for them as well. There were minutes of the overseas committee. The RPS inevitably formed a committee, as it seemed to do for everything it wanted to discuss. So the overseas committee was really important, and she was the chair of that committee for a long period of time, and then it got taken over by Edwin Appleton, who again had been a former president of the RPS. But those minutes probably are, I think, the only real paper trail that exists, and they record, they're quite interesting because they record the numbers of members in some of those chapters, a number of overseas memberships more generally and in particular countries. So there's a lot of quite hard information which isn't always apparent elsewhere in the RPS archive, and then also talks about what they're planning to do, what they're offering, and questions and queries that come back to the RPS and how they're going to respond to those. So those minutes are probably the most useful source for any researcher. I think the RPS recognised that it had a role beyond just the UK. I think it saw itself as the premier, the most important photographic organisation in the world. I think in some respects, I think that was fair comment. I think it probably was, certainly up to the 1960s, perhaps even into the early 70s or so. And as a result, it was clearly wanting to grow membership and support photographers outside of the UK. So I think for that reason, the RPS saw itself as important, and consequently, those members on the council which ran the organisation as volunteers and the staff, also recognised that they had to support the overseas members, even though they were a relatively small proportion of the total membership. And some of the staff, Lawrence Hallett, for example, who was secretary for a very long period, again, he undertook a number of tours and was promoting the RPS, was attending conferences outside of the UK, which he used as an opportunity to talk about the RPS and its activities. I know I've seen those numbers, and again they're in the minutes of the Overseas Committee. I can't recall what they are off the top of my head, but I mean the RPS today, we're talking in 2025 at the moment, but the RPS's overseas membership today is about 12-13% of its total membership, which is around 11,000. So it's a relatively small proportion, and I think probably in the sort of 50s and 60s it probably wasn't too dissimilar. I think it's always been a relatively small proportion, but quite significant. And also, I think the RPS always recognised that if it was to grow, then it needed to reach beyond the UK. And certainly, in recent years, and some of the conversations I've had with the trustees, then the potential for growth has always been seen as being outside of the UK, where there's a vast group of photographers, most of whom are not members of the RPS, whereas the UK is clearly much better served because the RPS can be more directly involved with what's happening in this country. It's a good question. I think it's hard to identify anything specific. I think the RPS always recognised it needed to do more to attract overseas members. So for example, the annual exhibition was always open to overseas members, and it set up what was called the joint entry system. And there was a member who was specifically responsible for that, and that was designed to support, in fact, mostly UK members submitting to salons overseas, and it would act as a sort of coordination point and bringing together material which would all be shipped over at once. I think it's hard to say that the RPS itself directly shaped some of those overseas societies, except perhaps for administrative matters around the constitutions. And I think people would look at the RPS's articles of association, they were called at that time, essentially the rules that govern the society, and often adopt those as a model and perhaps just tweaking them slightly to allow for any particular local issues that might needed to be accommodated. So I think the basic structure of the RPS sometimes was copied or used as the basis for local societies overseas, but I think beyond that it's hard to say it had much influence. I mean, even its activities I think were fairly straightforward in the sense that they would have included workshops, competitions, exhibitions particularly, and those were being done in the UK by the RPS. But I think if you were setting up a society in Singapore, for example, then immediately an exhibition would probably be at the top of your list. You'd probably want meetings, the opportunity to learn new skills in the same way as you would in the UK. So I think it's hard to say that what was happening here was directly sort of mirrored over there because they saw the RPS doing it, because I think actually they were the obvious things for any organisation to do and offer to its membership. I think there were certain things happening in particular countries that, particularly around the distinction submissions, that I think the RPS, once it became aware of them, and it was often the local coordinator that would make the RPS headquarters aware that they thought there might be something happening around people copying other people's work, for example, that then informed the RPS's own practice. So it would ask to see negatives, for example, to try and confirm that someone's work was their work and not simply someone else's. It's a difficult one to do, and those sorts of issues are still very much alive today with digital imaging, and potentially we can ask to see a raw file if we want to, but that's not always definitive. So I think there were things happening that certainly the RPS became aware of and needed to respond to, but certainly the example of people using other people's work to submit for a distinction was a very hard one for them really to deal with, because they couldn't really get the evidence, and it was, I think, bound up within a very small group of people within that particular country, and I won't name the names at the moment. There was certainly a relationship between the RPS and the British Council. The British Council came to the RPS on a number of occasions asking if it could use material from the RPS collection for exhibitions, or if it was trying to put a particular themed exhibition, whether the membership could supply images that could be used for exhibitions which then toured overseas. So that relationship was there. I think it's harder to say it was a very deep one. I think it was one of perhaps of a very practical relationship between the two organisations, in as much as the British Council wanted to exhibit or do a photography exhibition, and the RPS, because of its position and status within the UK as the sort of national body for photography, was the obvious place that you would go to ask for that and then try and secure that material. And then those pictures would then go on tour overseas. But the British Council, that relationship with the British Council continued right the way through till 1980s, 1990s. I don't think I've seen any evidence to show the sort of more direct governmental relationship. I think the British Council was the body that was, in a sense, promoting British values overseas, and particularly in the sort of decolonisation period, when it still wanted to maintain relationships and promote what we might call Western values. So I think the RPS wasn't sort of directly involved in that sense, other than through the British Council. The other way around though, the RPS was regularly in contact with government over matters affecting photographers, particularly in the UK. So it matters around the new Copyright Act, for example, when the Festival of Britain was being planned in the early 1950s, the RPS was wanting to be involved and had very clear views about how it wanted photography to be represented, which actually the government partly ignored and partly took on board. So I think there were sort of matters of national interest where the RPS had a particular view about photography and was able to put across, on behalf of photographers in the UK, how it thought photography should be represented, or matters affecting photographers that it had a view on. So the other example I can quote is around the import tax. So in the 1950s, after the Second World War, there was quite a high import tax on what were luxury goods like cameras and photographic materials, and although the RPS tried generally to avoid getting involved in commercial matters, it did take a view and did support lobbying of the government to try and bring that purchase tax down, because it was having an adverse effect on photographers who wanted to buy a camera from Germany or increasingly from Japan and Southeast Asia. So it was representing photographers' views to try and help them more broadly beyond just its own pure membership. So it did have this wider perspective. So I haven't seen any evidence that he came over to the UK. He certainly exhibited in the RPS's annual exhibition, and I suspect that would probably have been his main interaction with the RPS, and was exhibiting work through the exhibition, which probably was the most practical thing that he was able to do. I mean, obviously he could travel from Taiwan. I think travelling from China at that point, where he'd already moved to Taiwan, I think would have been more difficult. But I suspect it was the exhibitions and the prestige of the RPS that was important to him, and he obviously gained a fellowship as well, so that clearly had value to him. So I think his membership was largely around some of those points of value to him.